For decades, a set of blood samples sat frozen in a lab in Mexico City, waiting. Nobody thought they held anything controversial. They were just data collected for a routine national health survey. But when scientists finally sequenced the DNA inside them, the results didn't match the story Mexico had told about itself for 200 years. This isn't a story about conquistadors or textbooks or national myths. It's a story written in molecules, stretching back more than 15,000 years, from a frozen strip of land between Siberia and Alaska to the crowded streets of Mexico City today. And the deeper scientists dug into it, the stranger, older, and more layered it turned out to be. To understand why this discovery mattered so much, you first need to understand a question scientists have argued over for almost 100 years. Where did the first people in the Americas actually come from? For most of the 20th century, the answer seemed almost too simple. Near the end of the last ice age, small bands of hunters crossed a land bridge connecting Siberia to Alaska, called Beringia. Sea levels were low enough back then that a vast plain of grass and tundra opened up between the two continents, hundreds of miles wide in places. Mammoths crossed it. Eventually, so did people. That much scientists still largely agree on. What they've argued about for decades is everything else. How many waves crossed? When? And who these people actually were before they made that journey. For years, the leading theory pointed to a single culture called Clovis, named after a site in New Mexico where archaeologists found a distinctive style of stone spear point, sharp enough to bring down a mammoth. One wave, one culture, arriving around 13,000 years ago and spreading fast across two continents. It was tidy. It made a clean textbook diagram. It was also wrong. Archaeologists kept finding tools and campsites that were older than Clovis. A site in southern Chile called Monte Verde produced burned plant remains, animal bones, even a child's footprint preserved in clay, dated to over 14,000 years ago. That's roughly the same age as the earliest Clovis sites in North America, thousands of miles away. If people were already living at the bottom of South America at almost the same time the first Americans supposedly arrived, the old timeline simply couldn't be right. Something was missing from the story. That's when genetics stepped in, and where Mexico's story really begins. Reading DNA from ancient remains isn't as simple as it sounds. Bones and teeth that have sat in the ground for thousands of years are usually contaminated by soil bacteria, by the hands of the archaeologists who dug them up, sometimes by the DNA of whoever handled them in a museum drawer decades later. Researchers have to work in special clean rooms, wearing full protective suits, extracting fragments of genetic material so degraded they have to be pieced back together like a shredded document. It's slow, exacting work, and for years it limited how much ancient American DNA scientists could actually study. Only in the past 2 decades, as sequencing technology became faster and cheaper, did it become possible to read enough ancient genomes to start answering the bigger questions. Starting in the early 2000s, researchers began comparing DNA from indigenous communities across the Americas with DNA from Siberia and East Asia. They weren't looking at full genomes the way people imagine today. They were tracking small, specific markers, tiny variations passed down largely unchanged from parent to child for thousands of years that act almost like a fingerprint of ancestry. Some of these markers travel down the maternal line, others down the paternal line, and by comparing patterns of them across populations, scientists can estimate how closely related 2 groups are, and roughly when their ancestors parted ways. The results confirm the broad outline of the Beringia story. Indigenous peoples across North, Central, and South America, including the ancestors of Mexico's indigenous nations, trace their deepest roots to Siberia, not Europe. Not any of the lost tribe myths that European scholars invented for centuries to explain who these people were and where they'd come from. The DNA was blunt about it, but it also raised a question nobody expected. The genetic signature didn't match any single Siberian population living today. It looked like something else entirely. A population that had been cut off, isolated from everyone else for thousands of years before it ever set foot on this continent. That led to one of the most striking ideas in the entire field. Scientists call it the Beringian standstill. Picture a small population of hunter-gatherers trapped on that land bridge or in a sheltered refuge near it for thousands of years, blocked from moving further into North America by walls of ice more than a mile thick in places, cut off from Asia behind them and from the rest of the continent ahead of them. Genetic estimates suggest this isolation lasted long enough, potentially several thousand years, for this small founding group to develop its own distinct genetic identity before the ice finally opened a path forward. When the glaciers did retreat, most researchers now believe people moved south not through some ice-free corridor cutting through the middle of the continent, but along the Pacific coastline, following the shore on foot, and quite possibly by simple boats, harvesting shellfish and marine life as they went. From there, their descendants spread out across 2 continents, eventually reaching what is now Mexico, and continuing all the way to the southern tip of South America within just a few thousand years an astonishingly fast expansion once it finally began. In other words, the deepest ancestors of Mexico's indigenous peoples weren't simply wanderers who drifted in from Asia one day. If this evidence holds, they were survivors of one of the longest waiting periods in human history, isolated for millennia in a frozen corner of the world before finally being able to move. This coastal route has its own nickname among researchers, the Kelp Highway. The idea is that thick kelp forests once lined the Pacific coastline almost continuously from Japan to Chile, creating a single unbroken ecosystem rich in fish, shellfish, seals, and sea otters. For people who already knew how to live off the sea, that kelp forest would have worked almost like a highway, offering food and shelter at every stop along a journey of thousands of miles without ever needing to venture inland into unfamiliar territory. It's an elegant idea, and it fits the evidence surprisingly well, but because rising sea levels have since drowned much of that ancient coastline underwater, the physical proof, campsites, tools, hearths, is mostly sitting on the ocean floor today, difficult and expensive to reach. So while the Kelp Highway theory is now widely favored, it remains, in a very literal sense, hard to fully confirm. That alone would be a remarkable finding. Then, ancient DNA revealed something even harder to explain. In 2015, researchers studying the genomes of indigenous groups in the Amazon rainforest found a faint genetic echo linking them to populations on the opposite side of the planet in Australia and New Guinea. Scientists nicknamed this signal Population Y. Nobody has fully explained how a trace of Australasian ancestry ended up buried in the genetic history of the Americas. Some researchers think it points to an earlier, largely vanished migration that left barely a trace anywhere else on the continent. Others think it reflects ancient population structure that already existed somewhere in Asia, long before anyone crossed into the New World. Nobody knows for certain. It remains one of the most debated open questions in this entire field, a reminder that the story of how humans reached the Americas still has gaps nobody has fully closed. Mexico sits right at the center of all of this, not just geographically, bridging North and Central America, but historically. Long before Spanish ships appeared on the horizon, Mexico was home to some of the most advanced civilizations on Earth. The Olmec, often called the mother culture of the region, the Maya, whose astronomers tracked the movement of Venus with startling precision, and whose cities featured plumbing systems more advanced than anything in medieval Europe. The Zapotec and the Mixtec, master metalworkers and record keepers, and later, the Mexica, the people most today call the Aztecs, who built a capital city, Tenochtitlan, on an island in the middle of a lake, connected to the mainland by causeways and canals. Spanish soldiers who saw it firsthand described a city larger, cleaner, and more orderly than most of what they'd left behind in Europe. These weren't primitive societies waiting to be found, as generations of colonial-era writers like to suggest. They were the product of thousands of years of movement, adaptation, and innovation, all tracing back, genetically, to those first travelers who crossed out of Beringia. That innovation shows up in surprising places, not just in cities and pyramids, but in something as ordinary as a cornfield. Roughly 9,000 years ago, in the Balsas River Valley, in what is now the Mexican state of Guerrero, early farmers began domesticating a wild grass called teosinte, transforming it, generation after generation, into modern maize. That single act of agricultural engineering would go on to feed much of the world. Geneticists have actually traced this same story in plant DNA, the way they trace human ancestry in ours, and the results point to that one valley in Mexico as the birthplace of one of humanity's most important crops. It's a reminder that long before anyone in Mexico was mixing with anyone from across an ocean, indigenous peoples here were already reshaping the world through science. They simply didn't call it that. Then, in 1519, everything changed. When Hernan Cortés landed on the coast near what is now Veracruz, his small force carried something far more devastating than steel swords or horses. They carried diseases indigenous populations had never encountered before: smallpox, measles, typhus. With no prior exposure and no built-up immunity, these diseases tore through indigenous communities with terrifying speed. Within a few decades, they had killed a majority of the indigenous population of central Mexico. Historians consider it one of the deadliest demographic collapses in recorded human history, and it happened well before most large-scale battles of the conquest were even finished. This is where Mexico's genetic story takes its next turn, and where a much more painful chapter begins. Over the following 3 centuries, Spanish colonization drove what historians call mestizaje, the biological and cultural mixing of indigenous peoples with Spanish colonizers. This wasn't two cultures meeting as equals and gradually blending together. It happened inside a brutal colonial system built on forced labor, a rigid caste hierarchy, and, all too often, sexual violence against indigenous women. Understanding modern Mexican genetics means understanding that the numbers researchers eventually measured represent real human suffering across many generations, not just a chart on a screen. Colonial authorities didn't just let this mixing happen quietly. They tried to categorize it. Spanish officials developed an elaborate and increasingly absurd system of racial classification known as the Sistema de Castas, sorting people into dozens of labeled categories based on precisely which combination of Spanish, Indigenous, and African ancestry they supposedly carried, with your category often determining your legal rights, your taxes, even what you were allowed to wear in public. It was less a scientific system than a tool of colonial control, and it collapsed under its own complexity long before any of these labels were ever tested against a strand of real DNA. Centuries later, geneticists would essentially be asking the same question the Spanish crown once tried to police by law: who is mixed with whom and by how much? Except this time, the answer would come from the genome itself, not from a colonial bureaucrat's guess. By the time Mexico won independence in 1821, 3 centuries of this history had reshaped the population entirely. And that brings up a word most people have heard, but few actually understand in scientific terms: mestizo. For most of Mexico's modern history, national identity was built around the mestizo, a person of mixed Indigenous and European ancestry, promoted through the 20th century, especially after the Mexican Revolution, as the symbol of a single, unified nation. It was, in part, a genuine attempt to move past the rigid racial hierarchies of the colonial era. But when scientists actually sat down and sequenced the DNA of Mexican citizens across the country, the picture that came back was far messier and far more interesting than one blended national identity. One of the most significant studies came from Mexico's own National Institute of Genomic Medicine, working alongside researchers at Stanford University. They analyzed genetic samples from indigenous and mestizo populations across several Mexican states. What they found surprised even the scientists running the study. There was no single genetic profile for a Mexican person. Ancestry varied enormously by region. In parts of the Yucatan Peninsula and Oaxaca, indigenous ancestry remained overwhelmingly dominant, in some communities exceeding 90%, despite 5 centuries of colonization, disease, and forced assimilation. In the north of the country, European ancestry ran far higher, shaped by different patterns of Spanish settlement, and by later waves of migration from other parts of Europe during the 19th and 20th centuries. There wasn't one genetic story of Mexico. There were dozens, layered on top of each other, shifting from state to state, sometimes even from town to town within the same state. And then researchers found something else, something that had been left almost entirely out of the national conversation for generations. Woven into the DNA of communities along Mexico's Gulf Coast and Pacific Coast, especially in a region spanning parts of Guerrero and Oaxaca known as the Costa Chica, was a genetic signature tracing back to West and Central Africa. This wasn't a footnote. Between the 16th and 19th centuries, Spanish colonizers forcibly brought enslaved Africans into Mexico, at times in numbers greater than the entire European population of the colony. Some enslaved people resisted outright. In the highlands near Veracruz, an enslaved man known as Yanga led a community of escaped slaves that fought off Spanish forces for years, eventually winning recognition as one of the first free black settlements in the Americas. Across the colony, enslaved Africans and their descendants worked in mines, on plantations, and in colonial households, and over generations, their ancestry became woven into the broader Mexican population, quietly erased from a national story that celebrated only the mixing of indigenous and European roots. For centuries, Afro-Mexican communities existed almost entirely outside official recognition. It wasn't until 2020 that Mexico's national census counted Afro-Mexicans as a distinct population for the first time. The genetic evidence had been there the entire time, sitting quietly in DNA along the coast. Nobody had bothered to look for it, and nobody had officially acknowledged it. You can still see traces of that heritage today, even without a lab. In Costa Chica towns, traditional dances like the Danza de los Diablos, performed at festivals with elaborate wooden masks and rhythms that echo West African drumming traditions, have been passed down for generations, an entire cultural memory surviving in movement and music long before science caught up and started explaining where it came from. Which raises an uncomfortable question. How much of a nation's identity comes down not just to what its people carry in their genes, but to what its institutions choose to see and choose to leave out? The deeper researchers dug, the more layers turned up. Some studies found faint genetic traces linking certain Mexican populations to Southeast Asia, most likely tied to the Manila galleon trade route, which for 2.5 centuries connected the Philippines to Mexico's Pacific coast, carrying silk, spices, silver, and people across the ocean in both directions. Mexico's genetic story wasn't shaped only by Europe, Africa, and indigenous America. It carries faint fingerprints of nearly every corner of the world that colonial trade routes touched. By now, home DNA testing kits have made a version of this discovery personal for millions of ordinary people. Someone spits into a tube, mails it off, and a few weeks later receives a breakdown of their ancestry that often looks nothing like what they expected. a Mexican customer discovering unexpectedly high indigenous ancestry from one region, or tracing a thread of African heritage nobody in the family had ever mentioned. These consumer results aren't always as precise as academic research, since accuracy depends heavily on the reference populations a company happens to have on file. But again and again, they've pointed ordinary families toward the same conclusion the scientific studies reached. The story is more complicated and more interesting than anyone assumed. So what does all of this actually mean for the people living in Mexico today? It means the idea of one uniform Mexican genetic identity, the image many people inside Mexico and out have carried for generations, simply doesn't hold up under scrutiny. Mexico isn't one genetic story, it's a mosaic, an ancient migration out of Siberia that predates written history by thousands of years, layered with the trauma of Spanish colonization, and interwoven with the long overlooked legacy of enslaved Africans and other more distant contributors from across the globe. And this diversity isn't spread evenly. It varies so much by region that two people, both proudly calling themselves Mexican, can carry ancestries that look almost nothing alike, one shaped overwhelmingly by Maya or Zapotec ancestors, another carrying a much heavier share of Spanish or West African heritage, both equally authentically Mexican. This is where the science stops being just academically interesting and starts mattering in very practical, sometimes life-saving ways. Because Mexican populations carry such varied combinations of indigenous, European, and African ancestry, genetic risk factors for certain diseases, including some patterns linked to type 2 diabetes, differ significantly between regions and communities. Medicine built almost entirely on genetic data from European populations, which historically made up the overwhelming majority of large genetic studies worldwide, can miss these differences completely. A drug tested and calibrated on European genomes, or a risk score built from European family histories, doesn't automatically translate to a population with a completely different mix of ancestry. That's part of why projects mapping Mexico's genetic diversity, including an ongoing national genome initiative, matter so much. They aren't cataloging ancestry purely out of curiosity. They're trying to build a more accurate picture of human genetic diversity so that medicine actually works for the people it's meant to serve, rather than just the populations that happen to be studied first. It's worth pausing on how recent all of this really is. For most of the 20th century, doctors and researchers simply assumed genetic findings from European or American clinical trials would apply everywhere else, more or less unchanged. Mexico's own genomic research only began correcting that assumption in the last 20 years or so, which means an entire earlier generation of Mexican patients was treated, diagnosed, and medicated using a genetic map that, in a very real sense, wasn't actually built for them. None of this diversity is a flaw in the data or a problem to be resolved into some neater, simpler answer. It's the actual finding. Some of the same research teams studying Mexico's genome have noted that indigenous populations here rank among the most genetically diverse in the entire Americas, largely because Mexico's landscape, mountain ranges, deserts, dense tropical forest, kept many communities relatively isolated from one another for thousands of years, even before the Spanish ever arrived. Isolation, it turns out, doesn't erase history. If anything, it preserves it, letting each community carry forward its own distinct genetic signature largely undisturbed. There's still plenty scientists haven't figured out. The exact number and timing of ancient migrations into the Americas remains an active, sometimes heated debate, especially with newer finds, like disputed fossil footprints in New Mexico that some researchers argue are over 20,000 years old, continuing to challenge the accepted timeline. The full meaning of that mysterious population Y signal is still being investigated, with new ancient genomes potentially reshaping the picture every few years. And the true scale of African ancestry across Mexico's different regions is only beginning to be properly documented, after centuries of being left out of the historical record entirely. There's something worth sitting with in all of this. Every nation tells itself a story about who its people are, usually a simpler story than the truth, because simple stories are easier to teach, easier to build a flag around, easier to fit on a census form. Mexico's story, for 2 centuries, was the mestizo, one nation forged from 2 roots. It wasn't a lie, exactly. It just wasn't the whole picture. The DNA doesn't erase that story. It adds to it, filling in an ancient migration that predates any nation by thousands of years, an African heritage that outlasted its own erasure, and a level of regional diversity that no single label was ever going to capture. What makes this discovery so extraordinary isn't just what it reveals about the deep past. A vanished land bridge, thousands of years of isolation, the collision of continents and cultures that followed. It's what it reveals about identity itself, about how the story a nation tells about itself can diverge so sharply from the story written in its people's DNA, and about how much history, real, complicated, sometimes painful history, has been sitting quietly this whole time, encoded in something as small and as permanent as a strand of DNA, simply waiting for someone to finally read it,